Good morning, everyone. I'm Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for New American Security, and I'm really pleased to welcome everyone to our 17th annual CNAS National Security Conference. This year's conference, held in partnership with Axios, will focus on American power and purpose. And over 3 days, experts will explore the new challenges, ideas, and voices transforming America's national security landscape. It's a particularly appropriate and perhaps even a dramatic moment to have these discussions given the pace of change in today's world. The world's witnessing two simultaneous revolutions, one geopolitical and the other technological, that together are upending traditional patterns of international behavior. The geopolitical revolution can be seen in stark relief following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That act marked the end of the post-Cold War era and the beginning of something new. And though the precise contours of this new global era remain blurry, several features are nevertheless clear. First, the forces that drove 3 decades of globalization, economies of scale, a focus on efficiency and growth, integrated supply chains, unprecedented levels of cross-border investment and technologies that allow the offshoring of services, all those forces remain in place, but they're increasingly contested by what you might call the revenge of geopolitics. Countries, including the United States, are now willing to pay an economic cost to reduce national security risk. We see this in the calls for de-risking and more. America's economic agenda today is, for example, largely defensive, focused on export controls and investment reviews, sanctions, rather than aimed at liberalizing trade and investment. Private sector is more concerned with geopolitical risks than at any time in recent memory. And so we're seeing not the end of globalization, but rather a move toward a different and more limited form of it. The second feature of this geopolitical revolution is that the world is rearming. Europe's increases in defense spending following the Russian invasion are well known at this point, but other countries, including those worried about China rather than Russia, are following suit. Japan's set to double its defense budget over 5 years, making it the third largest defense spender in the world. Japan wants an offensive strike capability. Australia seeks nuclear-propelled submarines. A majority of the South Korean population wants nuclear weapons. Taiwan's extending conscription. And the post-Cold War peace dividends are finally coming to an end. Third, we see today the outlines of political military blocs, even as rival blocs remain deeply intertwined economically. Russia and China have forged a quasi-alliance, one aimed at revising a global order that they believe doesn't accord them their rightful places. They increasingly work with Iran and North Korea, two other revisionist powers. NATO is working alongside key Pacific countries, not as allies, but in security terms ever more closely, and identifying similar threats and challenges in both sides of Eurasia. And the G7 unified to support Ukraine and punish Russia. There's a lot of countries that wish not to be forced into choices between the blocs, but nevertheless, on specific issues are going to face a whole array of choices that derive from the preferences of one or the other of those blocs. The fourth feature is that ideological competition's back in a way far different than before. Many countries, both democracies and dictatorships, now claim to deliver to their people the benefits they seek and better than the other model. China and Russia insist that their systems are democracies, just of a non-Western sort. And we see a contest of ideas that has reemerged. And fifth, and perhaps most obviously, U.S.-China competition has emerged at the world's defining feature, even with the war raging in Europe. Virtually no issue and no country is going to be immune from the U.S.-China competition. And all this, I submit, amounts to a geopolitical revolution. It requires new approaches, new ways of thinking and acting, new partners, and new coalitions, the kinds of things that I hope we will have the opportunity to discuss over the next 3 days. That geopolitical transformation is accompanied by a technological one that is touching every aspect of our lives. Everyone knows the headlines around AI, autonomy, advances in semiconductors, automated bots, quantum computing, all of the rest. But to see how these developments are changing international affairs, just look for a moment at the war in Ukraine. What would the battlefield in Ukraine look like without drones or autonomous missile defense systems? Would public knowledge of Russian depredations and outrages in Ukraine be far less if the Ukrainians themselves weren't digitally connected to social media platforms, including through satellite internet service? What would international support look like if President Zelensky hadn't been able to zoom into meetings of legislatures and leadership around the globe, rallying the world to assist Kiev's cause? Ukraine illustrates just some of the effects of new technologies on international behavior, and there remain many questions. But looking at the big picture, our colleague Paul Share compares artificial intelligence to other general purpose technologies like electricity, the internal combustion engine, computer networks. And like the coal and steel and oil that fueled previous industrial revolutions, Paul says that AI is likely to have similarly transformative effects across society, increasing economic productivity, accelerating scientific progress, and transforming military power. This is all happening right at the moment when we gather for this conference to discuss these national security matters that are challenging the country and the world. We meet amid these two revolutions, the geopolitical and the technological, whose interplay will shape the contours of tomorrow's world. And that brings us to the theme of the conference, American Power and Purpose. American power remains, for all the talk of decline, vast in virtually every dimension: military, economic, demographic, geographic, technological. And by many measures, and contrary to some of the predictions, U.S. power is actually increasing. So what's the purpose of all that power? What is American purpose? In this time of narrowly construed national interests, the United States should retain, it seems to me, a uniquely expansive view of its international responsibilities. Today, global order, balances of power, and the future of freedom all hang in the balance. A strong United States active in the world is, to my lights, the best guarantor of the things that we hold dear. And this year's conference will provide an opportunity to discuss and debate such matters and bring together those whose views vary considerably. You have ahead of you a series of interactive hybrid sessions on issues like the future of defense, alliance structures, and the economic security agenda. The conference will culminate in The Pitch, the center's fourth annual competition of ideas. We call that Shark Tank meets national security. And we have a full day ahead of us today. We'll get started in just a moment with a discussion of cooperation among China, Russia, and Iran. Before we begin, I'd like to take just a minute to recognize our conference sponsors: American Rheinmetall Defense, GE Aerospace, the Boeing Company, Palace Advisors. Thank you to all of you and to our institutional donors for helping make this work and this conference possible. For those who'd like to engage with the sessions over the next 3 days, you can follow us on Twitter at CNASDC. You can tweet using the hashtag CNAS2023. And you can also join the conversation and submit questions by using the chat on the official conference website. That's at conference.cnas.org or cnas.org/live. So now to our first session. This is a panel that will look at the axis of authoritarians, the implications of cooperation among China, Russia, and Iran. There are three superb CNAS experts who will discuss these matters, and the discussion will be moderated by Bethany Allen Ibrahimian. She is the China reporter at Axios, who has been with us before, and it's great to have her back dialing in from Asia. And I will turn it over now to Bethany to get the discussion started. So Bethany, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm thrilled to be back again this year moderating another great panel for CNAS. Our panel discussion this morning for me is, despite the very serious topic, kind of a treat because I'm bringing together three experts from three different regions who, and rarely do we have on one panel the interplay of all three regions. We have Russia, the Middle East and Iran, and China. And I'm particularly interested in all three of these. I've visited all three of those countries. I personally have spent all my adult life focusing on China. And I think that the interplay between these three countries is increasingly important. So that will be the focus of our panel today. And one sort of historical, just quick note before I introduce our panelists is one thing, since I've visited these countries and studied all three of them, one thing that strikes me about them is all three of them, Russia and Iran and China, are the authoritarian successors of former multi-ethnic empires. And it's interesting that in the world today, in some ways, they are playing a similar role or looking to each other to support their goals on the world stage. So with that, I will jump right into introductions. We have joining us today Andrea Kendall-Taylor. She's a senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at CNAS. She previously served as a senior intelligence officer and led the U.S. intelligence community's strategic analysis on Russia. Jonathan Lord is a senior fellow and director of the Middle East Security Program at CNAS. He previously served as a professional staff member for the House Armed Services Committee and managed the U.S. Central Command Middle East Defense Portfolio. Jacob Stokes is a fellow in the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security, where his work focuses on U.S.-China relations, Chinese foreign policy, and Asian security affairs. He previously served in the White House on the national security staff of then Vice President Joe Biden, where he was senior advisor to the National Security Advisor and acting special advisor to the Vice President for Asia Policy. And today, our discussion will be in a slightly different format. So what we're going to do is each panelist is going to posit a truth. And the other panelists have the opportunity to either tear that apart or to build on it further with their own analysis. So I'm going to turn first for our first truth to Andrea Kendall-Taylor, who has a sweeping one to begin with that brings in points from all three countries. Andrea, over to you.
Wonderful. Well, this is so much fun. I'm really happy to be here, and thanks for leading us through this conversation, Bethany. Okay, so my first truth, I think, gets at, as what you were alluding to in the beginning, the interplay between all three. So my truth is really about synergy and this idea that the cooperation between Russia, China, and Iran amplifies the threats that they pose to the United States. So to put that differently, I would say by working together, the challenges that they pose collectively add up to be more than the sum of their parts than any one individual challenge if they were working on their own. So over to you, Jake and Jonathan, to tear it apart or agree. But yeah, curious what you guys think.
So I'll jump in. I generally agree with that. And I think that's well recognized, at least in Beijing, as they think about their own position, including to topics like the war in Ukraine. I would just add, I think that increasingly authoritarian regimes, all three of these who feel insecure at home, have taken to pursuing political opponents overseas. And that's also made the competition have more of a global character. And the result has been a pretty expansive and aggressive transnational repression campaigns that are also helping to bring the ideological aspects of strategic competition to the fore. So in addition to, I think, the security and strategic elements that Andrea was referring to, I think that authoritarian domestic politics is increasingly linked to foreign policy in ever more direct ways, and that's kind of creating or adding to this sense of a global competition. It's not just a series of regional competitions.
Start with unmuting myself. Just really excited to be here. This is my first CNAS conference on this side of the camera. So I'm eager to be here and join my fellows in this discussion. I can't agree more. We see this on a strategic level. We see it on a tactical level, but there's no question that the cooperation we're seeing between Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing at a military security capacity makes all three stronger. Particularly, I think this is most visible right now in the cooperation going on between Moscow and Tehran, where Iran is providing UAV technology to Moscow in its war in Ukraine. And as a result, Iran has now acquired fifth-generation Su-35 fighter jets, possibly air defense to come in the future, and loads of other forms of cooperation, which will ultimately have major impacts in the Middle East, not just on the United States, but on its partners and allies as well, and not in the long-distance future, but immediately. And certainly when it comes to Beijing's role in the Middle East, I think they're likely operating on a slightly different level than Russia. They're probably operating more in parallel than in total concert. But Iran and Beijing are clearly working closely together to strengthen both of their spheres of influence within the Middle East to the detriment of other powerful actors.
Yeah, maybe just to put a little more meat on the bones to pick up where Jonathan left off, obviously the military piece of this is really key. And you mentioned this now, I think what the United States has called a fully fledged defense partnership between Russia and Iran. But we see that kind of same synergy between Russia and China also, where Russia, especially the more desperate it becomes, may be tempted, or actually I shouldn't say tempted, required to pass along increasingly sophisticated defense and military systems to China, which then amplifies the challenge that China would pose in the Indo-Pacific. So the military piece of it is really key, but I'm also thinking about the economic realm. And so I think what we're seeing, again, in terms of the synergy, all three countries working together to really restructure trade. They're building these trade routes, overland railways, and other things that really make the trade between them safe from U.S. interdiction, right? So they're recognizing U.S. military strengths and able to adapt so that they can insulate themselves from U.S. and Western pressure. The sanctions evasion piece has been really key. So obviously Tehran has been an excellent teacher for Moscow. Not that they probably needed so much teaching because they're very adept at doing that, but working with Iran and also to some extent China working around sanctions. And I think moving away from the dollar. I think I recently read it's the yuan overtook the dollar in the most traded currency on the Moscow exchange. So in the economic sphere, they're really working together in ways that mitigate any Western pressure and are tools of economic coercion. And then the last realm, which is also important, and I'll turn it over to you guys to respond, is the diplomatic realm. I think by working together, and especially, I think China probably is doing a lot of heavy lifting in this regard, but it's really making it a lot easier for America's traditional security partners like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Jonathan, if you want to weigh in on that, but to hedge. It's easier. So a lot of those countries, I think it's made it easier for them to stay on the fence and not condemning Russia in its war in Ukraine because they give each other this backing. And then I think the thing that I'm ultimately worried about moving forward is they're giving each other, like, I think, additional self-confidence that they can move out knowing that they've got partners who can mitigate Western pressure and some diplomatic cover that they can perhaps move out more belligerently and aggressively than they would if they didn't have that cover coming from each other.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we're seeing it in real time in the Gulf. I was just in Abu Dhabi in March, and while I was there to do research to explore the avenues and the reaches of a CENTCOM-led Middle East regional architecture, I wasn't alone in Abu Dhabi. At the very same time that I was there, at the time, the Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, Ali Shamkhani, was actually there as well. And I was a stone's throw away from him, which was odd to say the least. But he was in the country to brief Mohammed bin Zayed and Tahnoun bin Zayed, the leaders of UAE, on the deal that had been announced just that week that was inked between Beijing and Saudi Arabia and Tehran, the joint trilateral agreement. And it was basically offering them a way in and sort of demonstrating the grandiosity of both Iran and China and what they could offer the Gulf if they joined hands. It'll remain to be seen what, in fact, comes from the deal itself. But I think we need to look very carefully at what the deal is purposed to do. I think for Beijing, it's exactly as what Andrea suggests, and I'm sure Jake has a good comment on this too. But China definitely took the opportunity to sort of parade around the world stage and demonstrate that we, like the U.S., can be a global diplomat, an agent of stability. It's not the U.S.'s world anymore, and we have the power and influence to end conflicts and change the tectonic plates under which geopolitics operates. And for Iran, it was an opportunity to legitimize themselves on the world stage and continue this pursuit of lead and gold, or lead and silver rather. You can have outreach with us, you can legitimize us, or we can continue to attack you through asymmetric means. And so those things are always happening at the same time. And for countries like the UAE, one need not preclude the other. I mean, they are very much in a position where they are now on the fence and open for business, both East and West. While I was there, CENTCOM was hosting a Ministry of Defense conference with senior non-commissioned officers from both countries. While I was there, my friends at the Atlantic Council down the street were hosting an N7 event exploring the reaches of what both UAE, Israel, and other Abraham Accord signatories could do to address water scarcity and other non-military issues. And of course, none of that begins to touch on the fact that China is ever present in UAE, elsewhere in the Gulf, in infrastructure, in economic projects, and assuredly, whether covertly or not, in military projects as well.
Yeah, I would just add a couple of things. I agree with all that. I think one key for assessing the contours of cooperation among this axis or lack thereof is kind of seeing how the improvements, especially in military and technological and even diplomatic coordination, are growing, but generally from a very low base. So I think, or a relatively low base. So you've seen some major improvements, particularly in military cooperation between China and Russia, but there still isn't kind of direct operational coordination, and their military exercises are getting more sophisticated. But compared to something like NATO or the U.S., South Korea or Japan alliances, the real deep interoperability and the planning that goes around that, I think, is still it's beyond nascent stages, but there are still more ways that it could advance. In terms of the security hedging, I agree that that's sort of what we're seeing in the Middle East, but I feel like in East Asia and to a large extent in Europe, there's been something of the opposite effect, where increased China-Russia cooperation is actually driving liberal democracies to work closely with one another and to actually revitalize their alliances with the United States or security partnerships with the United States, and increasingly in a network sense with one another. And that's been a really important trend, particularly in the Indo-Pacific that we've observed. And even while states like India continue to have a certain amount of hedge, you could argue that India's deepening defense partnership with the United States is a hedge against its traditional relationship with Russia that is becoming increasingly in question as Russia becomes more beholden to China.
If I could jump in here, I'm really curious about something, and I know that it relates to something that both Andrea and Jonathan kind of have truths to posit about. How has Russia's invasion of Ukraine affected this whole dynamic?
I can jump in to start. I mean, I think it's been an accelerator. So none of the dynamics that we're talking about are necessarily new, right? So we've been talking about the deepening partnership between Russia and China for years, and certainly that's a trend that's been continuing at least since the waning days of the Cold War. So that's not new. 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea and then subsequent occupation of eastern Ukraine was a key catalyst back then. And I think it's another catalyst again. And of course, there are limits to this no limit partnership. But for me, I think this conflict has strengthened their partnership in some really important ways. And then the same thing I think is true also of the Russia-Iran relationship. I mean, Russia has had a history of mistrust with both of these partners. So there is that history there. But I think that, with Iran, the repeated interactions working through the JCPOA, Russia and Iran's ability to coordinate and work together on the battlefields in Syria, these repeated interactions were helping to overcome some of that historical mistrust. So then you arrive in February 2022, and I think it's another important kind of catalyst or accelerator of the trends that we've been seeing for a long time. So again, none of this is new, but I do think with events, in particular Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that it's been a real catalyst for these relationships, and it's given greater impetus by creating these geopolitical conditions that have been very conducive to pushing these actors together. I mean, I think if we just think about some of the key drivers of the relationship, they do all have this hostility to the United States and the status quo. And here's Russia saying, we are going to challenge the status quo. And so it's created some momentum for both Russia and China to be able to take advantage of this moment, in particular by trying to rally some of the countries in what we're calling the so-called global south, or some other countries where there has been a lot of discontent and dissatisfaction with the United States and the US-led order. They've been able to leverage that in this moment. So what we're saying here isn't new, but I think what we're seeing is an acceleration and a coalescence of these allies, or I shouldn't call them allies, of these three countries.
Bethany, in the spirit of debate and sort of punching it up a little, I'm going to disagree a little bit with Andrea a little bit when it comes to whether this is new or not new, and I'm going to do my best to channel the academia of my good friend and colleague Sina Azodi at GW, a lecturer who's done a lot of historical study on Iran's national security history, and I do think the depth of Moscow and Tehran's relationship right now is something a little bit unprecedented. If you go back a couple regimes, there was a time when, in fact, Iran sought to bring in Western powers to check Russian aggression on its own borders. There has been immense division between Russia and Iran, immense geopolitical competition and local geographic competition, over terrain even, especially. What I do think we're seeing now is a major shift where the Supreme Leader's guidance of neither East nor West is yesterday's news, and there is a clear shift from the Supreme Leader on down to face eastward and work with these partners, deepen these relationships into alliances perhaps that historically Iran has been reticent to do in either direction under various governments. So I know this has some of our friends and partners in the Middle East quite concerned because they do see this as a depth of partnership that is otherwise previously unprecedented in the modern era, and therefore, could hearken new levels of cooperation to their detriment.
Jacob, I'd like to hand things over to you for you to posit one of your truths.
Okay, thanks, Bethany. Yeah, so I will posit the following truth. I think for Beijing, some degree of weakness in its partners is actually a feature, not a bug, and that China wants to be at a minimum first among equals, and at a maximum really the dominant power with a veto over the affairs of what we could describe as client states. I think we should keep in mind that there's really an alternative world where Russia and even Iran could help counterbalance Chinese power in Eurasia, and that's something ultimately that Beijing wants to avoid. In addition, a weak Russia in particular has to accept increased Chinese influence in Central Asia and also defer to Beijing's prerogatives in East Asia on issues like Taiwan and the South China Sea. At the same time, this is my own hedge here to my truth here. China wants to avoid a complete collapse of its partners in the face of pressure from liberal democratic states, which explains some of its policies in support of Russia, Iran, and even North Korea. And then finally, as part of this, we've seen this debate recently among international relations scholars, most prominently in foreign affairs, about how to describe polarity in the international system. And I think this is important because despite its rhetoric to the contrary, China doesn't actually seek multipolarity. Instead, what China wants is a bipolar system where partners align under a China-led pole focused on countering the United States. And I think that kind of overarching goal is important in kind of describing how China wants the dynamics of this axis to function going forward.
Yeah, your polarity piece is really interesting because for Russia, one of the longstanding pillars of its foreign policy is that it envisions a world of multipolarity with Russia as one of the poles. So at some point, I think we've all recognized there could be tension in the relationship as there's growing asymmetry between Russia and China, but that's not happening for the time being. And I think right at this moment, given Russia's weakness and its obviously clear concerns about what's happening in Ukraine, they're perfectly fine to be a junior partner. And I think that Moscow likely recognizes that there is going to have to be some concessions made to Beijing in order to keep Beijing firmly in Moscow's corner. And I think that's one of the concerns of this axis of authoritarianism, is that the weaker Russia becomes, the more they're going to have to give away and toe the line on Beijing in particular. And you talked about Central Asia. So that's something where, Russian influence has severely been diminished, as a lot of the Central Asian leaders are now looking extremely warily at Moscow, worried that they could be next. So we're seeing really important geopolitical shifts there in Central Asia that I'm sure Beijing will be all too happy to cash in on. The other area I'm watching closely too is the Arctic. And I found it extremely fascinating to see that Russia and China recently signed an agreement between their coast guards in the Arctic. That was such an interesting indicator, because Russia for so long has gone to great lengths to try to keep China out of the Arctic. It is really a region that Russia views, its preeminence in that region. And so to see them willing to give on, it's something small, but I think it is this indicator that they are going to increasingly have to give more and more away to keep Beijing on side. So I totally agree. From Beijing's perspective, I'm sure that they are perfectly happy to have somewhat weakened partners so that they can take advantage of and leverage in that. And for the time being, that's not a problem for Moscow.
As for the Middle East, I certainly see Russia and China largely, working at different levels and attempting to get different things out of the region. I mean, Russia always enjoyed a security cooperation relationship with a range of states. That's going to be difficult. I think Andrea can speak to that much better than most people. That, recently, I think in Moscow, we saw a parade where I think there might have been one World War II era T-34 tank. I think the Ukraine war has heavily attrited their ability to sell arms of any value to Middle Eastern partners. So if I'm an American security cooperation officer working in the region, I see great opportunity. But for Russia's purposes, its geopolitical presence, its military strategic presence in places like Syria, Tartus, Latakia, gives them their sole warm water port in the world. China has a much broader view of the region, and really, though it's a security cooperation partner for many countries, it's really its economic projection into the region, its foreign investment in the region is really the primary tool. And when I think of perhaps with a soft underbelly of U.S. policy in terms of where we can counter, that's clearly where our foreign policy toolkit is the weakest. We've always really been, certainly called ourselves the partner of choice. Our military presence, I think to this day, we've got over 35,000 forces in the region. We are there to assure the partners. But what happens the day after someone flicks a switch and Huawei networks take over, and all of a sudden it becomes impossible for the U.S. to securely operate its systems in many of these countries. So slowly, shwaya shwaya, as they say in Arabic, we can see ourselves pushed out of the region from the side, so through these lateral means. And I think there is an effort by this administration in particular that recognizes the need to harness U.S. economy to create some sort of alternative future, to drive U.S. investment into the region, as well as to harness the investment capability of our partners in the region to ensure that Beijing doesn't have the world's supply of critical minerals going into this century when they're going to be so desperately in need.
On your on the arms sales point, Jonathan, I was reading, I think Russia is buying back weapons from India and other places. So if we come back around to talking about opportunities, the arms market and trying to weaken Russia's historical links to some of these countries is a really important one.
Yeah, I would just add, I think on China's involvement in the Middle East, for a long time, China tried to just engage economically as a partner there and sort of avoid the politics of the region. As China makes this foray into regional problem solving and seeking to be a peacemaker between Iran and Saudi Arabia, In some ways, that's a very good trend for the region, for the world, and I think the U.S. has rightly welcomed it insofar as it goes. But I think that's the key part, right, is what happens when the notoriously difficult politics of the Middle East, rear their head. What is Beijing prepared to do to support a particular set of regional frameworks? And basically, when China is tested, China's diplomacy is tested on the regional and international stage, what's Beijing's capacity and willingness to push the parties together to sustain that peace over time? That's kind of the bigger question, and we're really in a wait and see posture there.
I have my own truth I'd like to posit, and I actually disagree with it, so I hope that you guys can just tear it apart. One thing that I've heard a lot is that the Russia-China axis is weaker and more brittle than and less resilient than like the U.S. Relationship with Britain or other democracies, because the Russia-China relationship is one of convenience, that it's based on not on shared positive goals, not on shared values, but simply on a shared foe. Please, someone destroy that. How about Jacob? We'll start with you.
Sure. So I think that it is much deeper. I mean, as Andrea mentioned, this is something that's been decades in the making and has spanned multiple leaders in both countries. And I would describe it as kind of a couple that divorced in the Cold War and really knew where the fault lines in their relationship were, and they've kind of come back together and worked really hard to avoid or cordon off and or deal with some of the most difficult areas of their relationship. And I think that's one of the things that gives the China-Russia relationship its durability, is they are the ones that are most aware of these kind of fault lines. And in addition, you just have in Xi and Putin two increasingly personalized leadership systems, and it's clear that the leaders are committed in their own version, in their own views about grand strategy to this relationship. And I think that is both based on a reading of their current circumstances, but I think it's also deeper than that, in the sense of you see lots of overlap in how they view the history, including, how the Cold War ended and what has happened in the intervening years. I mean, I think there really is a lot of consensus between the two leaders about the kind of trajectory of global politics and where they want to take it. And especially as, the systems are increasingly, especially in China, just a reflection of the more personalist views, the role that the leaders play is really important. Whether or not they're actually best friends or whatever, I think we can set that kind of thing aside. Some of that is pomp and circumstance, but I think if you just sit down and do kind of a nuts and bolts reading of what the leaders want and then how that's translated into the system, there is a lot of more durability and resilience built up within that. In addition, I think they see themselves as having the same problem set, essentially, right? That in the parts of the near abroad that they are most focused on, they face a wall of U.S. Alliances and partnerships that not only kind of hems them in a security sense, but in an ideological and regime type sense, poses a threat to their domestic power at home. And so I think on those three levels, sort of the leadership, the strategic, and then the domestic politics level, they're very much aligned in that perspective. And I think that creates some durability that we're going to have to contend with, at least as long as the two leaders, Xi and Putin, are sitting atop their respective systems.
Yeah, I think the thing, I don't know if I can tear that one apart, Bethany, because like talking about the US, UK, it's a really high bar, right? It's hard to think of many countries in terms of, we have this special relationship. So our military cooperation, our intelligence sharing, that really is, I think, a high bar. So I wouldn't say that Russia and China really approximate anything like that. But I think that's a little bit misleading and it leads to faulty conclusions because, as Jake said, for all the reasons Jake just laid out, there is a significant overlap in their interests. And by working together, again, it goes back to the synergy argument, they amplify the challenges that they both pose. So they might not be, they're not interoperable. They're probably not having the same degree of intelligence sharing, or probably certainly not the same degree of intelligence sharing as we have with the UK. But those things are deepening over time, and through repeated interaction, they are building the scaffolding of a more lasting and deeper relationship. But even short of the US-UK relationship, it still has tremendous potential to cause challenges and risks and threats to the United States and its allies and partners. So I think it's really important. I know we get often caught up. Is it an alliance? Is it an entente? What is this? But I think if you really focus on concrete areas of their partnership, you could start to outline some really important areas where by cooperating together, they are posing real challenges to the United States and its allies.
Yeah, if I can just add, I think there's an important policy implication for the U.S. and its allies here, because there's still this persistent argument in American strategy and others that we just have to do a reverse Kissinger, right? Split somebody off from the other and figure out a way to drive a wedge in between the two. I think that searching for that, and you've seen that, we saw, Republican presidential candidates tweeting this exact idea yesterday. So it is very, very much alive in the debate in a real way. But I think we have to not set that aside, but we have to have nuanced metrics in trying to figure out when the time might be ripe to do that and on what issues it might be possible. But we have to be realistic about its prospects, especially in the near term, and focus, I think, on another set of strategic responses, which is trying to still have the preponderance of power amongst our network of allies and partners, right? If it's Russia and China versus the U.S. alone, sure, they can actually have more landmass, more people, all of a lot of technological power, more military strength. But if it's the U.S. and its alliances and partnership network versus Russia and China, we still have the preponderance of power in every area. And so I think being able to double down on that, deepen it, sustain it over time is really critical. And versus a short-termist ploy to try to find wedges or drive wedges between China and Russia that might come at extremely high cost. For example, making major concessions on Ukraine or Taiwan, and not create much benefit for the United States or other democracies.
If I can jump in really quick and just remind the audience that we are accepting questions. So send in your questions and we can get to them later. Jonathan, over to you.
Yeah, and of course, I'm going to defer to the Russia and China expert in the virtual room here. But just to your original truth, Bethany, I'm not so certain that powerful alliances require ideological alignment. I think historically, if we look back at what formed the 20th century, I don't think FDR and Stalin necessarily had a lot of ideological alignment, but the combined power of USSR and the US in World War II was probably unmatched and unmatchable by the Axis, right? So there is definitely opportunities for these partners to come together absent any great ideological alignment, just, sort of in service of each other's near-term or strategic individual needs against the U.S. and its allies. And to Jake's point, I think he's spot on. We have a national defense strategy which identifies China as the pacing challenge, Russia as the acute threat, and then sort of as a tertiary trying to contain Iran. And as we execute this strategy, we are going to see these partners come together as we are. And Jake's absolutely right. We need some middle game here, and it's not necessarily wedges, but we need to understand that as we play, the adversary is going to adapt, and we need to look carefully at the toolkit to understand what our counterpoint to that adaptation is.
I'm curious about, we've talked somewhat less about Iran, and Jonathan, in your truth that you had that you have written out ahead of time, you mention Israel's interests and how they might come into play in this. And just one more plug for viewer questions, please do send them in.
Yeah, no, my truth that I posited was that as Russia's back gets further up against the wall, Iran is going to be able to ask for more and more from Russia in order to support Russia and Ukraine and sort of give them an opportunity to stay in the fight. And that is going to have immediate impacts on Israel's security. One near-term, almost immediate example is for years now, Israel has targeted Iranian Quds Force targets in Syria as they transit materials and sensitive things to Lebanon for potential use against Israel. That's what the Israelis call the war between the wars. In Hebrew, it's milchama ben hamilchamot, or mabam for short. In doing that, the whole time, they have quietly tiptoed past the Russian presence in Syria, and the Russians have seen them do it and watched as they had targeted and killed Iranians without turning on their own air defense systems or doing anything to otherwise stop or make it more difficult for the Israelis to engage Iran. What happens when Russia becomes so desperate that Iran can ask Russia to turn on its air defense in Syria and otherwise make it more difficult for Israel to interdict these shipments of weapons to Hezbollah and other proxies? What happens when Iran successfully takes ownership of advanced air defense systems and deploys them not only in Iran itself to defend against possible U.S. or Israeli military incursions against nuclear sites, but also is able to deploy them in Syria and elsewhere to take down Israeli planes engaging those targets on a fairly regular basis? The cooperation has a lot of avenues. Cyber, hypersonics could make Iranian rockets, ballistic missiles, and systems much more deadly. And already, I have some real concerns that many of the kit and weapons of U.S. origin being taken off the battlefield in Ukraine, specifically the Javelin anti-tank guided missile system or the Stinger anti-air system, they've got units of that in Tehran right now that they're working to reverse engineer. And while the chemistry and the engineering of those systems makes it hard, you get enough engineers in the room and give them enough time, they're going to do it. The Iranians have done this with a number of U.S. systems that they've then successfully used themselves and deployed to their proxies for use against the U.S. And Israel. So the Israelis have to be wondering, what does an Iranian variant of a Javelin anti-tank missile do to a Merkava tank in the hands of Hezbollah on its northern border, and so forth and so forth. So the threat really compounds. And the Israelis have to be asking themselves, what coercive tools do they have against Moscow to attempt to limit that cooperation such that it doesn't begin to directly or more so threaten them? But also, we have to be asking ourselves about our strategy, about how our Middle East strategy now comports or parallel lines with our broader NDS goals, and how we can bring some of our partners into greater global alignment in the way we see the threats emanating from both China and Russia, as they don't threaten just U.S. interests, but those of our partners and allies as well. That was a lot of truth.
I mean, I would just add, I mean, I think from one of the major challenges that this axis is going to pose, especially in the context of the military technological developments that Richard mentioned earlier and you alluded to here, is some of the structural elements of military technologies, whether it's hypersonics or autonomous systems or more traditional nuclear weapons delivery systems and warheads. We're going to have to build often in consultation with Russia, China, and to a certain extent Iran as well, some 21st century vision of an arms control regime or management regime. And that's just going to be incredibly difficult given the expansion in size and sophistication of China's nuclear arsenal to the point where increasingly China is moving to a place where it's on par with the U.S. In Russia as a nuclear power. It's going to take some time, but it creates a unique three-player problem at the very top of the nuclear arms control world that's structural and really is going to force us to rethink some of the underlying premises that we had from the Cold War, where it was more of a bipolar competition. And of course, as all these other things are going on, where tensions in the relationship are deepening, that sense of rivalry is deepening, being able to make progress on just those security issues, setting aside climate change, migration, all these other transnational issues, is just going to become that much harder. So I think while we have this, while we need to maintain a very competitive approach in this kind of major power competition against authoritarian powers, we still have to have a realistic, coherent way of engaging them on some of these key issues where they're essential players, and where our alternative of having no agreements and no constraints on an arms race is actually much worse than working something out with our competitors. But it's gonna take time and a lot of innovation, frankly, in the policy space and in the implementation space to get that done.
I'll just pick up on one point you said, Jake, which is like the democracy versus authoritarianism. That's clearly what it is. But it's not a useful framing, I don't think, for engaging a lot of the countries who are, in the middle or the swing states. That is not a frame that's resonating with large parts of this so-called global South and countries that we want to reach out to. So I think, as we're thinking about, well, what do we do about this? Your point that you made earlier, Jake, about the coalescence of United States allies and partners is key. We probably haven't talked enough about that, because it's there. But I think we do have a problem with these in-between states, and using this framing of democracy versus authoritarianism is not a winning strategy. And many of the countries that sit in that middle are also authoritarian, right? Jonathan, this is largely a lot your world, but it's not just there. And so I think the unfortunate reality, you're saying, yes, it will require outreach to Russia and China on some really important issues like arms control. I fully agree with that. It will probably also require some compromises, if we want to use that word, in figuring out when is the right time to push on democracy and human rights issues, and when is that going to jeopardize our interests in competing with this sphere. So as you said, it's more complicated, it's more complex. The democracy versus autocracy works with our allies, but it doesn't work with these other countries. And we've got to figure out the pragmatic areas of cooperation to engage so that we can, grow the coalition of countries that we're cooperating with in order to enhance our ability to compete.
If I could address that, I think, in putting a plug for a former CNAS event, actually, if you go back and watch the speech that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan gave at Georgetown, where we hosted in coordination with Georgetown the rollout of the National Defense Strategy, his language was very careful. Basically, he was opening the tent to autocratic regimes, and the litmus test of whether you were on sides with the U.S. is, do you support a rules-based order? Does might make right, or are you willing to engage in diplomacy and recognize the national sovereignty of the world's nations? And that was basically the test by which one was on sides with the U.S. or not. So I think he took a very open and broad view of welcoming otherwise autocratic countries into the fold in the context of our national defense strategy. To Jake's point about coming to grips with arms control, there's, in some respects, nothing more crucial. And I'll offer just maybe a secondary truth here that our friends in the intelligence community might refer as a low probability, high impact scenario. We think about where Iran is on its possible pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability. And right now, in terms of timeline, about 2 weeks we'd posit until they have enough fissile material for weapons. But the weaponization would take considerably longer. Different analyses out there have different timelines, but roughly, let's say, a year until they could put that material into some sort of advanced system to deliver it. That's a capability that Russia has right now. And so does there come a point where Tehran makes the decision that it wants that it wants to shorten its timeline? Or conversely, and I don't want to put any ideas in anyone's head, is that something that Moscow uses to extract concessions from the West? Is that something that they could use to try to barter a better deal or exit from Ukraine? So, I mean, clearly the arms control aspect, strategically speaking, is something that's eclipses and overshadows all the other aspects of this. And frankly, we need a better solution for it, to Jake's point.
Yeah, I just have one thing to add for that, if I can, which is on Andrea's point about the Global South. I think I try to keep this in mind because I focus on China every day in my work, but I think a lot of our success in engaging the Global South or the developing world more broadly is not only not leading with that democracy versus authoritarianism framing, but also not leading with the China-Russia framing, right? To engage those parts of the world on their own terms. And I think that's aside from strategic competition in a broad sense, and in many ways, that's where China is succeeding in the sense of really working on, development, investment, those kinds of things, with all the strings and complications and often negative things that come with that. But regardless, that's the focus of their engagement, and really that, I think, particularly in Latin America and parts of South and Southeast Asia, that are so critical to U.S. interests. We have to have a more coherent story to tell there, and that's often or almost usually not about military affairs. It's about trade and investment, people to people, some of those, for lack of a better word, softer parts of foreign policy, but ones that have real meaningful strategic effect. And I always try to keep that in mind in terms of, we have to really get our arms around this challenge of the axis of authoritarianism to the extent that it exists, but we can't let it consume our entire foreign policy. And that's really a very tough balance to strike that I know the administration, at least in their formal sense of the national security strategy, tried to strike. But there's going to be this temptation in different parts of the U.S. foreign policy debate to only do strategic competition or only do engagement on softer issues like climate change and human development. But it's always going to be this tense balance that we're going to have to get right over time, and that's going to be a challenge for years and decades to come.
Can I make one point, Bethany, because I feel like I have been remiss not to have said it so far. These personalist dictatorships, first and foremost Putin, but increasingly Xi Jinping, are prone to miscalculate and make mistakes. Putin's invasion of Ukraine was a gross miscalculation, and so it is extremely incumbent on the United States and its allies that we are able to take advantage and exploit the mistakes as they make them. And so it brings us back to Ukraine. It is so important for the United States and its allies to ensure that Vladimir Putin is defeated and that Ukraine comes out of this conflict on top. I think if we're to, what are the things that the United States can do to shape the strength of this alliance? Getting Ukraine right is really critical. It's obviously critical for our Russia policy, but it has ripple effects for Xi Jinping and his calculations, and I think for the emboldenedness, if that's a word, of this access of authoritarianism. So I just really wanted to be sure that I made that point, that getting Ukraine right is really critical for our ability to compete and manage this coalescing alliance. If things had gone differently in Ukraine, I think we would actually be having a very different conversation about the strength of this axis of authoritarianism. We're very fortunate that the Ukrainians were able to repel the Russian attacks to put us in the position that we're in now. And so now it's really incumbent upon us to finish the job. And that, again, goes just such an extraordinary distance, I think, in making this a more manageable challenge.
I think that's a great place to finish and to wrap it up. Thank you so much to our three panelists for lending your expertise in this very lively discussion. Our next panel is Home Before the Leaves Fall, Protracted Wars, Past, Present, and Future. It will begin at 10:10 Eastern Time. Please join us for a discussion on the nature of protracted war with CNAS defense experts Andrew Metrick and Stacey Pettyjohn, hosted by my colleague David Lawler of Axios. Thank you again.